As a user of this WPF application that uses Firebase Authentication, I want my login state to be saved between sessions. So ideally what would happen is I would open the application, log in, and then if I close the application and reopen it, my login state would be saved and I wouldn't have to go through the login form again. So this is different from what we have now. So if we demo the app right now, so I go through this login form, so enter my credentials and log in. Here we go, success, get taken to the next page of the app. But if I close this and then open it again, I have to go through the login form again. So ideally, again, I would just want to go to the next page of the application and skip this login form. So in order to implement this behavior, we're going to have to follow a few steps. So for one, we need to persist the user's authentication state somewhere. So whenever they log in, or whenever their authentication state is refreshed, or whenever any change occurs in their authentication state, we're going to want to save that authentication state somewhere. And then whenever the user opens the application, we're going to want to load up that saved authentication state. And once we have that loaded up, we're going to have to make some decisions. So for one, if the authentication state is invalid, or we didn't even find an authentication state, then right off the bat, we know to display the login form because we need to get their credentials again. But if we successfully load the authentication state and the authentication state is not expired, then we can move on to the next page of the application and not show the login form. But if the authentication state is expired, then we want to attempt to refresh their authentication state using their refresh token. And if that's successful, then we have fresh auth and we can skip the login page. But if that's unsuccessful, then the authentication state is expired. And at that point, we just have to get new credentials. So somewhat of a complex flow here, but what are we waiting for? Let's tackle step one and let's save the authentication state somewhere. So if we go to our authentication store, at this point, this is where we execute the login and we also execute authentication refreshes. So getting back new tokens and refreshing the auth. So since this authentication store centralizes the authentication state, this is where I want to handle the behavior of persisting the authentication state. So how are we going to persist this? So straightforward approach is just writing it out to a file. Would probably make sense to encrypt the authentication state before we persist it, but we're not going to tackle that here. Instead, we're just going to write it out to a file just as regular JSON. But we're not going to create the file ourselves. Instead, we're going to leverage the built-in WPF settings files. So if I go to our project and click properties, then come over here to settings on the left, and then we have this general section, and we can create or open application settings here. So let's do that, and that's going to create this settings file over here. So settings.settings. And this is just a key value store of settings. For example, the application can save a user's color preferences, then retrieve them the next time it runs. So based on this use case and example that they spell out here, this seems to be perfect for what we're doing, where we're saving their authentication state and then loading it up the next time we run the app. So we are going to save that here. Let's scaffold out a setting for that. We're going to call this Firebase Auth. It's going to be a string because we're just going to save it as JSON. And then we're going to scope this to user. So each user will be able to save their own Firebase Auth. So let's save this and then we'll be able to access this Firebase Auth in our app. So here we go. Let's go back to the authentication store and let's use that settings file. So after we log in, we get this Firebase Auth link, and I just want to save the data on that auth link to our settings file. So the first thing we need to do is serialize it to JSON. And for this, we're just going to serialize with system.text.json, so the built-in .NET JSON serializer. So we can do JSON serializer and import that from system.text.json. And we want to serialize this Firebase Auth link. So now that we have the JSON for that, let me specify this is JSON. Let's save that to our settings file. So we can do properties.settings. And we want to grab the default settings that we just created. And we want to set the Firebase Auth. So we have this property right here that matches the key that we just added to our settings file. And we want to write our Firebase Auth link JSON. And then to actually save that, we have to explicitly call save. So we can take our settings and call save. So after we log in, we're going to save the Firebase auth. But I also want to clear the Firebase auth whenever we log out. And I also want to save the Firebase auth whenever we refresh it. So first step, I'm going to move this to its own function. We'll call this save authentication state. There we go. So that'll serialize the Firebase auth link and save it to our settings file. So now I also want to save authentication state whenever we refresh here. So first off, let's do the refresh and throw that into our current Firebase auth link. And then same behavior as before, we're eventually going to return this Firebase auth link. But then in between here, we want to save authentication state, and that'll save the refreshed Firebase auth. So now the last thing I want to do is clear the Firebase auth whenever we log out. So let's do that in the logout. So we're going to set the Firebase auth to null and simply save those settings. And maybe for clarity, we'll extract this to a function as well. Clear authentication state. So at this point, we are successfully persisting the Firebase auth state. But another thing I need to persist is the expiration time of this Firebase auth. And this is going to be useful for when we load up the Firebase auth, and we'll be able to use that expiration time to know if we need to refresh the auth or not. So in our settings file, let's add another key here. We'll call this the Firebase auth expiration time. And for the type here, I was just going to save this as an ISO date string. But instead, it looks like we can save this just as a system.datetime. So why not? Let's do that. All right, so save that. And now if we go back to the authentication store, we should be able to write this Firebase auth expiration time, which we can. And if we look at the type, it is a date time. That's good. So let's calculate the expiration time. So we can do a datetime.utc now, and we can add seconds, and we can grab the amount of seconds to add from our Firebase auth link. So that has this expires in property, and this expires in property is how many seconds until the Firebase auth expires. So we'll add that to the current time, and we'll know when this Firebase auth will expire. So it should be good for saving that time. Let's also clear that time whenever we clear authentication state. So we can just set it to datetime UTC now. So at this point, I'm satisfied with how we persisted this authentication state to our settings file. So next up, let's load up this authentication state and initialize our authentication store from that state. So that being said, we're going to have an initialize method up here. We'll make it async, call it initialize. So first step here, we need to load our Firebase auth JSON from that settings file. So this is the Firebase auth JSON, and that's in our properties file. So settings, default, and the Firebase auth. And now we need to deserialize this JSON into a Firebase auth. So let's do that using JSON serializer again. But this time we're going to call it deserialize, and we're deserializing into a Firebase auth object and just passing in that JSON. So might have created some confusion here. So as we see, we're deserializing into a Firebase auth. But as we recall, we serialized and saved a Firebase auth link. So the reason we're not deserializing into this Firebase auth link is because this has a parameter constructor that takes things like this auth provider and this Firebase auth. So this isn't really something that we can simply deserialize into. So instead, we're going to deserialize into a Firebase auth, and then we're going to use this Firebase auth to initialize this Firebase auth link, because as we can see here, this takes a Firebase auth. And we also have our Firebase auth provider already in this authentication store, as we see here. So we'll have everything we need to initialize this Firebase auth link. So that'll be good. So the last question you might have is, how can we deserialize into a Firebase auth when we serialized a Firebase auth link? And the reason we can do that is because Firebase auth link inherits from Firebase auth. So all the properties are there and saved in order to deserialize into a Firebase auth. So this approach will work just fine. And now that we have this Firebase auth, we can create our Firebase auth link. So let's initialize that. We have our Firebase auth provider already in here. So let's pass that in. And then we just pass in our deserialized Firebase Auth. And we're going to have a lot more complex logic in this initialize method to handle edge cases, but let's just continue implementing the happy path. So after we get our Firebase Auth link, let's just set it as the current Firebase Auth link. Alright, so now let's get into edge cases. So if this Firebase Auth JSON that we load from our settings is undefined, so we never actually logged in and wrote this, then we shouldn't attempt to deserialize it. So we're going to do a check here for if it is null or empty, and if it is, we're just going to return early. But then if we actually have JSON, we can attempt to deserialize it and get back this Firebase Auth. But if this deserialization fails, this Firebase Auth could be null. So let's null check that, because if it is null, then we don't want to continue and attempt to create this Firebase Auth link. So at this point, we'll be able to create a Firebase Auth link, but this Firebase Auth link might be expired. So let's do our expiration check using our expiration time that we saved. So let's get that expiration time loaded up. So the Firebase Auth expiration time, and grab that from our settings. Here we go. So if this expiration time is less than or equal to the current time, and again, sticking to UTC, so UTC now, then that means it is expired. So at this point, we need to refresh our auth. So let's take our Firebase Auth link and get fresh auth async, and we'll have to await that. And let's move that into our Firebase Auth link. And I actually looked at the source code of this get fresh auth async method. So it returns a Firebase Auth link, but it's actually the same instance as the auth link that we use to refresh the auth. So really, we don't have to do this reassignment. So let's just remove that. But nonetheless, we'll refresh our auth. And at this point, we'll be able to initialize our current Firebase Auth link with a fresh and valid Firebase Auth link. So now that we're able to initialize this authentication store, we're going to have to call this from somewhere and navigate to the correct page based on the result of initialization. So I've really been debating where I want to put this logic. So ideally, I think it would make sense to put this in the main view model and maybe have some kind of load command on that main view model where we could do all that initialization. And then if we're loading, we would just show a loading spinner. And when we're done loading, we would show whatever page we want to show in the app. But can't really do that here because this main view model is part of the MVVM Essentials package that I had created. So we'd have to modify that package to support that behavior. So perhaps I'll come back to this and add a way to support this initialization behavior that we need. Another thing I was thinking is maybe we could do the initialization on the login view model. So have some kind of load command on here. And what that would do is check if we already have a valid authentication state that isn't expired, then we would just navigate to the next page in the app and skip the login view. But I was thinking I don't want to overload the login view model with this complex logic, so I'm going to rule that one out. So the last idea I had was we could really do the initialization before we show the main window, and then right here we could decide which page we want to navigate to based on the result of initializing the authentication store. The only downside to that is that we're not going to be displaying our main window until we're finished initializing the auth. So that delay before showing the main window kind of worries me because I really want to give feedback to the user about whether the application started as soon as possible. So we can work around that by adding a splash screen. So we'll add that in a little bit. First off, let's get this behavior down with initializing the authentication store and navigating to the correct view. So let's make this on startup async. I would say async void is okay here because we're handling the startup of our application, and typically it's okay to have handlers be async void. So now getting into the logic, we're going to take our authentication store. So first we're going to have to resolve that from our services. So get the authentication store, and then we're going to initialize it. And at this point, I want to check if the initialization was successful. And if it was and we are logged in, then we'll go to the home view. And if we're not, we'll just go back to the login view and the user will have to log in. So ultimately what we're checking here is if we're logged in or not. So we're going to have an is logged in property on the authentication store. So if we are logged in, we will navigate to the home view model. But then if we are not logged in, then we will navigate to the login view model. So last piece of the puzzle here, let's implement this is logged in property on the authentication store. So we are logged in if the current Firebase auth link, which could be null, so it's optional chain. But if this Firebase auth link is not expired, so let's do is not. So if the auth link is not expired, is logged in will be true. But if this current Firebase auth link was null, then we're just going to fall back to returning false. So let's add that as a fallback here, because obviously if there's no Firebase auth link, then we are not logged in. So this should be everything we need. Let me scatter around some breakpoints and we'll test this out, and then we'll come back and add a splash screen. So let's make sure this works first. Let me put some breakpoints down and let's run this. All right, so application starts. We initialize the authentication store. Let's do that. At this point, we haven't saved any auth, so this should be empty. There we go. So we'll just return from this. Let's step out of this function. So not going to be successfully initializing this Firebase auth, and we are not logged in because we couldn't initialize it. So we go to the login view. So let's log in. So submit this login. Here we go, logging in. We get our Firebase auth link, and then we save that. So we write all this to our settings file, serialize the JSON. Here we go. We got our Firebase token in here. Probably have a refresh token somewhere in here as well. And again, we probably should encrypt this because these are sensitive pieces of data, but skipping over that for now. Then we also save this expiration time. So here we go. That is an hour from now. So that's good. So we save these settings, continue, and we logged in. That's good. So now let me leave the application. So exit that out and let's start this up again. So same thing, gonna initialize the authentication store, except this time we do have our Firebase all saved. So that's not empty. Let's deserialize that into Firebase auth, which was successful. So we got our Firebase token and our refresh token. So we're able to initialize this Firebase auth link. And are we expired? Probably not. So yeah, as we can see, this expiration time is an hour from now. So we shouldn't have to refresh, which we don't. And we set our current Firebase auth link. So that's all good. And since we set that, we are logged in because that auth link obviously is not expired. So let's continue, and we are on the home page. And our credentials definitely worked because we hit our API with that token and we got our secret message back. So now if I log out, let's start this up, and we should be on the login page because we cleared those credentials. So that is empty. And there we go. So the last thing I want to do is just add a splash screen. And I really haven't done any splash screens in a WPF application on my channel. So this will be new. Let's go to our project and let's add a new item. And let's select WPF over here and select splash screen. We'll just call this splash screen.png. So create that. And here we go. We got our splash screen over here, just the default, which we'll leave for now because I'm not ready to display my art skills. So let's run our app. We should see that splash screen and we get build errors, and it says an item with the same key has already been added. Let me try cleaning our project and building again. There we go, that worked. So there we go, there's our splash screen, and then our application loads. Then we're able to log in, close out, boot up again, get our splash screen, and then we go to the home page. So that splash screen, again, that'll be useful if we initialize this authentication store, and perhaps it takes a long time to refresh our auth, which could potentially happen since we hit the Firebase API to get fresh auth. And speaking of that, since we hit the Firebase API here, this could definitely throw an exception. So we should handle that exception here when we initialize. And in fact, let me just extract all of this into some kind of initialize method to clean it up here. So we'll call initialize, and let's wrap this in a try catch and move this all into the try part. So we want to catch whenever this refresh potentially fails, and if it fails, we want to navigate to the login view. So let's do that down here, and I want to be more specific about this exception. So I believe it's called a Firebase auth exception is what we're trying to catch. So if the refresh fails, we will catch that exception and just go to the login page, and the user will have to re-enter their credentials. And then maybe we should just catch all exceptions too and have a little fallback. And for this, we'll just show a message box because who knows what the exception is. Maybe we can't even boot up the application. So we'll say failed to load application, and this will be an error message. So hopefully we don't hit this, but if we hit any failures when trying to refresh auth, we'll just go to the login page. So overall, I'm pretty satisfied with how this turned out. I feel like this is pretty clean. So just to summarize, whenever the user logs in or logs out, or whenever their auth state changes, we represent that in this settings file that we created. So this is the built-in WPF settings solution. And in these settings, we save the serialized Firebase auth as well as an expiration time that we use to determine if we need to refresh auth whenever we load it. So that gets persisted, and whenever we boot up the application, we load that Firebase auth, deserialize it, and then determine if we need to refresh, do the refresh if we need to, and then set this Firebase auth link, which will essentially log in the user and allow us to skip the login page because the user will already be logged in. So we do all this initialization when we start up our app. We added a splash screen in case the initialization takes a while. But in this initialization, we initialize the authentication store that loads that Firebase auth, and we navigate to the correct page based on if we are logged in or not. I guess the only criticism I have of the solution here is that I feel like our authentication store is doing a lot now, since it's concerned with persisting the authentication state now, as well as handling authentication operations against Firebase. So perhaps I'd split some of these persistence methods into their own store or own service so that we can thin out this authentication store. But at least for demo purposes, I think this certainly gets the job done. So hopefully you can apply this solution to your own application in order to persist authentication state. I feel like most of these concepts would also work if you're not using Firebase authentication, so keep that in mind too. Aside from that, if you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave those below in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video or are enjoying the channel, consider becoming a member. Other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you. Alright, so quick revision here. So looking at the source code of this Firebase Authentication .NET package that we're using, so this Firebase auth that we serialize and deserialize into our settings file, it looks like it already has a way to check if our token is expired. And it can check this accurately because it tracks when the token was created and of course how many seconds until the token expires. So it uses that data, which of course we serialize into our settings file, and determines if the token is expired. So we could simply use all of this data and this helper method to determine if the token is expired, and we don't have to track the expiration time on our own. So if we look at what we did, so we have this Firebase auth expiration time that we saved to our settings, and then we use that to determine if we need to refresh. But we actually don't need this because the Firebase auth tracks us already. So we don't need to save this Firebase auth expiration time. So let's remove that. In fact, let's just go to our settings file and delete it. So there we go, no longer have that. And then, of course, this is no longer defined on our settings. So we're not going to do this check. So really all we need to do is call getFreshAuthAsync. And since we just checked the source code and confirmed that Firebase auth link knows when it's expired or not, then we can simply call this and it'll handle all the logic of knowing when to refresh or not. So in fact, I should show that. So Firebase auth link, we'll go to getFreshAuthAsync, and here we go, it checks if it's expired, and if it is, then it does the refresh. If it's not, then it just does nothing and returns the Firebase auth link. So all of this refresh behavior was really already implemented, so we don't need this custom solution that we had before. We can just call getFreshAuthAsync, which is nice because this is a bit simpler and we don't need to maintain that logic. And everything works as expected. There we go. My credentials worked, and I recall my token was definitely expired, so it seemed like our refresh worked and the expiration time check did work as well. Hooray!